where are you having problems with this tragedy? There are about 10 pages in here. They're very tedious, but they're so important at the theater. And they're very difficult to read because you have to keep in mind that Varro, when there's a difference between Augustine and Varro, it's Augustine's description of himself in Varro, not Lyotard's. You have to really be careful about that. Okay. And then at times it's not clear who is, in a sense, reporting information or reporting a particular a bias. Okay. But the theater stuff is fairly important because it's the model of the poets, the Greeks and their tragedies and comedies. And the tragedies and comedies were all about building the poets, making it work, so taking up rather difficult issues. So, again, questions?
Do you mind going into a little background on Varro?
I don't have that much in my head, okay? So it'd be best to get, what I do is usually go to Botanical 9 and 11, both of those, because they're usually done by some major scholar. They're old, of course, but that's where I go.
I think I only have like there's something.
I'm sorry?
I think I only have like
Yeah, well, you can go out to archive.org, that, and you find everything.
Yeah.
But they have both 9 and 11. And surely someone has written about it recently, but what is reported here is, for the most part, on pages 7 through 9, is Augustine's prejudice, so that he can make his point and went out. He doesn't care for pagan theatrics. He wants to make it religious. So why don't we begin on page 6, and I'll jump around and just stop and we'll talk or whatever you wish, okay? We desire pagan theatrics. Page 6. We desire the atheism of the Libidinal band. Notice that sometimes he will use the word atheism, and sometimes it means something that he doesn't want to be associated with, and sometimes he does. So you have to be really, sensitive to his switching around, trying to almost rehabilitate the word. Okay. Did you have a question? We desire the atheism of the libidinal band, and if it cannot be critical, that is to say religious, then it must be pagan, or pious, right? Then it must be pagan, that is to say affirmative. We have therefore to leap over 2 frontiers, that which separates the political from the apolitical, but also that which separates the religious from the secular. We have to say, for example, that there is perhaps more atheism, affirmative, in that religion of the low empire which Augustine detested and ridiculed, this religion in which for the least hiccup, the least scandal, a copulation without issue, a birthing, a tea, a military decision, there was a God. Just imagine, whatever you do, there's a God for that. You go pee, you go take a shit, you drink water, you have some wine. Every one of them has a God. I mean, that's what you call extreme polytheism. A god is several gods and goddesses attending the act, the patient and the agent, not to double them in a pointless spectacle, as Augustine appeared to believe, and no more to divest the alleged subject, implied in the act in question, of his responsibility. But because in this way, all these gestures, all these situations, and the life ever since, called the everyday as if there were another, on the one hand were valued as intensities, could not decay into utilities, and on the other hand did not have to be connected by a paradoxical, dialectical, arbitrary, terrorist link to an absent law or meaning. but on the contrary, being self-sufficient and their self-assertion never fail to be affirmed as singularities. You know, these sentences, these clause after clause after clause, normally they would be totally unacceptable. Okay? And some editor somewhere would want to change, some major editor, or somebody would publish the book. Okay? But again, this is the style that is going to support what he once said and heard in this book. The divine was simply this self-assertion. Perhaps nothing is closer to what happens on the libidinal band than the parody that theatrical theology makes of this popular religion. Half skeptic, half stoic, of late Rome. This is where he begins to talk about Verily. It is, in any case, even if we are unjust in its favor, much more atheist than the discourses of science, of politics, and critique of our contemporary liberators of desire, women, children, blacks, Indian spaces, and the proletariat, liberators whom we love, in whom, moreover, we too are. Between the theatrical theology and Judeo-Christian, who today still governs the critique of religion and political economy, there is no opposition between a eulogy to the divine and the world and a hymn to God at the expense of the world and in abstentia. There is the difference between two dispositifs, literally translated as apparatus of pathos. What does pathos refer to? Usually, it's it has several different meanings, but usually it refers to the audience, to move the audience, the emotions of the audience, to arouse them and to use those emotions to make people do what you want them to do, okay? As opposed to logos, which supposedly is based on sound principles of thinking and so on. This is where Klosowski begins. On his advice, let us listen to Augustine discussing the disjunction made by Varro between a fabulous or mythic theology and a civil or political theology. The Christian takes the example of the nuptial couple. Okay, so this is, again, from the point of view of Augustine. Okay, this is not Lyotard. And if for Genesis is among those present, to see to the untying of the virgin's girdle, and subbigus, to see that the bride is subdued to her husband, and prima, to make sure that when subdued, she is pressed tight to prevent her moving. Sounds like a rape, doesn't it? If they are there, what is the function of the goddess Protunda? She should blush for shame and take herself off. Let the bridegroom have something to do for himself. It would be most improper for anyone but the husband to do what her name implies. But it may be that she is tolerated just because she is a goddess, not a god. But what am I talking about? Priapus is there as well, that all too male divinity. And the newlywed bride used to be told to sit on this phallus, that monstrous obscenity, following the most honorable and the most religious custom of Roman matrons. So let our friends go and try to use all their subtlety to make a distinction between civil and fabulous theology, between the city and the theater, the temple and the stage, priestly ceremonies and poets' verses, a supposed distinction between decency and obscenity, truth and falsehood, solemnity and frivolity, the serious and farcical, between what is to be desired and what is to be rejected. So I've sort of mapped this out for you on page 3 of my notes for you. On page 7, we are told, I'm talking from the notes now, Veronian Theatrics, read by Lyotard, okay, discusses Genesis, the Roman goddess presiding over virginity, and how this goddess would have been received by the Romans. as one of a radical multitude of polytheistic and composable moments, encounters in the narrative. The complications, rape described by Augustine, question mark. Sex and paganism, not in Christianity, question mark. Intensities, question mark. Indecencies, question mark. Varronian theatrics prescribes the world based on a libidinal economy of a radical multiplicity of gods into pagan, non-positive affirmatives, intensities, versus voluminous theatricality. Plato, Augustine describes and divides the world based on a political religious economy of one god into positive, negative stases. Okay. I mean, it's very clear that distinction is being made. And then there's talk of flux and intensities and ecstasis versus stasis on pages 10 and 11. Augustine's attempts to return several reinscriptions of Varronian theatrics back into the negative. See, trying to pull it back. Varronian is way too affirmative. And so he must do. Augustine has to clean it up. After all, it's Augustine who gave us the doctrine of we are born with original sins in ourselves. And it was Pelagius who argued with Augustine and said, no, these kids don't have sense of their soul when they're born, these babies. But if you want to baptize, that's cool. So, I mean, why? Why would there be this thing about having the sin in our soul? The stain, okay? Why is it important? To keep people in line. Okay? Art is another positive way of talking about it. It is to remind you that you're a human being and you're given to doing some pretty bad things. Okay? So what would the world really look like? Go do a test in your head from time to time. Without Augustine. I think you can come up with some inferences that would want Augustine's view of the world to stay with. But, you would want different takes on it. Okay? You don't want this kind of what would be seen as suppression of human beings. So you'd be rather pragmatic, I would think. Okay? There was a time when I did not believe that the whole doctrine of the stain on the human beings. But it's clear that we're pretty fucked up. We're given to doing, and maybe that's the political system. Sometimes the political system, and do you have a new man, a new woman, and so on? I don't know. Recall Nietzsche, centuries later, in his trying to return us to Varronian theatrics in the birth of tragedy, as well as in the genealogy of morals. So you see that there's a huge kind of conversation that's going on through the ages. But they play as examples in this book on the libidinal economy. And the position is, pull out the negative. And then when you read what happens to Marx here, what Lyotard does to Marx, making him into a hermaphrodite, I would think that you would have mixed feelings about it. Not choose one or the other. But don't contradict yourself. Just to have mixed feelings. Okay, on page 9. First full paragraph. In its appearance, delirium and madness, and in its essence, divine intentions. Listen to the father of the church, Augustine, attempting to cleave intensities. This is from the City of God, Book 6, Chapter 9. They want to derive the name Liber from Liber Aumentum, deliverance, on the ground that through his assistance males are delivered from semen and coition. Besides this, they have women as well as wine designed to Liber, with a view to provoking sexual desire. And in this way, Bacchanalia were celebrated with all their limitless insanity. Varro himself admits that the Bacchants could not have performed their feats if their minds had not been deranged. Okay. One thing is certain, such performances would never have taken place in the theater. They had entertainment there, not raving madness. And to have gods who delight in such entertainment is similar to a kind of lunacy. And where's Antonin Artaud? That is how the excellent father, well, that's rather snotty, prepares a generalized closure of appearances under the name of symptoms. The devaluation of the given functions fully, that is to say, intellect. The movement of forces becomes commotion of the spirits, and soon Dementia and Amentia. The pagans call it Dionysus and Bacchus, names of inestimable singularity. And note Augustine's paralogisms, his faltering way of paying tribute, nevertheless, to the forces of their theatrics. The Bacchants were prey to rage and madness. This cannot be seen in the theater, where one only acts, although theater plays are such that they can please only the gods, who were also seized by furor. The implication is direct, and pagan furor is divine. Fury is divine, okay? We catch Augustine here in the act of folding the libidinal band into itself in order to produce within it a volume and a chamber. So he's modifying it, okay? Of presence, absence, okay? Intensities will need to be filtered and imparted to the active voice of the zero in order to balance all the accounts. And we see how he cannot succeed in doing this, how the difference between play and madness, simulacrum and truth, clowning and seriousness is not successfully set up. This affirmation of the band, this banditism, is written in a pain which makes the hand tremble. Let's listen to it. Yeah, it's the hand moving from the finger to the hand. This is certainly more important than what was said. The pain is not a sadness or a loss or a force, but the opposite. It is stamped with an expenditure of force. Important quantities of energy, libidinal energy, employed to make something bearable, which is not bearable. Perhaps this same accumulation of forces. Crying, yelling are within the hand's capabilities. Figures, meanwhile, the hand continues to advance its pen through Dionysus groves. Figures of life and death are accumulated. Figures which are this same energy fixed for a moment and for an eternity, in which devour it. Mistresses of wild beasts, Egyptian face. Here we go. Negev hair, Istra-colored androgyny, unmanageable girl child. And then we get the event of the Egyptian face. If you had picked up this book on your own and started reading, would you have purchased it and would you have read it carefully? This is not pass fail, okay? I'm just wondering, because it's really demanding. It's something you have to, almost do by yourself, okay? Although, we're doing it this way and we can stop and talk about it and so on, which is good too. So in reading groups, it might, but would you?
Yeah, I did.
Oh, cool. What made you, did you just discover it, or did someone say something?
I think I started in a bookstore. I was 16 or 17.
Whoa.
Looked really interesting. And I just like, oh, that was really weird. So.
Honestly, I'd probably just read it for prose and the ideas, and not go into it that deep. More just let it be generative for other ideas. That's what I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is something definitely struck me reading it. It was like reading Henry Miller, those parts of him where you just like go, you know,
Perfect example.
and enjoyable in that way. But I think I definitely had this impulse to ascertain the framework that he's building or destroying.
Yeah, in Miller, what we have are Libidinal installments, as well. I mean, that great line in Tribe of Kings where he talks about, I love all things that flow, which really isn't what we pick up in place and somewhat modify in the Theatricals. Elizabeth Gross has written about this a lot. Earlier I said something about throwing semen, given the word seminar at each other. But what we're doing in reading this, potentially, is throwing or sharing all kinds of liquids. Okay? What Gross says is men work very hard to suppress women's fluids, and only their fluids, men's fluids, are acceptable to men, which is sort of a homosocial view. Okay? See, this book, for me, is a book that opens up all the fluids. And so in reading the book, in a sense, we're sharing all of these fluids. There is the simple biological fact that because we are in this room 3 hours in the morning, 3 hours in the afternoon, we're sharing fluids. When we exhale, when the cells do this. Kind of weird to think that, isn't it? It's things. Fluids.
And we share heat.
Yeah. About the, yeah. Exactly. But that passage in Henry Miller, so do you know this passage? Do you know what I'm talking about? It's a mixture of all kinds of fluids that you would never want to put together. Far from, violating kosher laws. I mean, it's, it's pus, it's everything, all mixed together with things that, are good fluids, we would think. Which is what? That passage, when he says, I love all things that flow, is an acceptance of one's body. Okay? An affirmation of one's body. And the book, is very Whitman-esque. Henry Miller is very Whitman-esque. He wants to affirm everything as best as he can. It does not mean there's no sense of justice. I mean, in Leaves of Grass, he points out the very specific things that we have neglected to think about. Yeah.
Do you think that there's more violence in them than Whitman, and how would you place Lyotard relative to
In Miller?
as regards violence? Yeah, I mean, I'm asking. Obviously, I think that there is. I'm wondering if you would agree with that or not. And either way, where you'd place Lyotard relative to the two in terms of the violence of their flow.
Well, I think there's a tremendous amount of violence in Libidinal economy, for example, and in the book that we read, and they even, in Just Gaming, they refer to it. Here, it's, remember the passages I was just reading about the pain. He's beginning to introduce pain now, which, you would associate with a sublime. And if all fluids are moving, that is a sublime situation. The people would find themselves in. But in here, there is tremendous pain for becoming a singularity, reducing acts of negation. but it's a pain that can be enjoyable. So yeah, there's Klosowski, the reference to Klosowski, it's Salamensky, but not as sick as, there's some, there are people who do particular things, health things, because they cause a little bit of pain and it's sort of pleasurable, okay? But then towards the end of this book, which we'll get to tomorrow,
But we'll get to it tomorrow?
yeah, but it's on page 261, so you can correct it. I'm sorry? Oh, not tomorrow.
Confused by the
I mean afternoon. Wait a minute.
This afternoon.
Oh, this is, God, I am so lost in my head. Whenever. No.
Later today.
Yeah, we still have lunch to do.
Yeah.
I mean, I have to do dissertation defenses, which I love. It's better than lunch. So. But it's on the bottom of page 261. I'm sorry, I don't know where I am, okay? I'm lost here. In this book, is it always this harlequin, the reference to the famous harlequin? Harlequins, costumes of libidinal fragments, no sooner assimilated than it collapses into rags? Will it neither run its course or pursue its inquiry in its political economics of publishing, literature, and thought? Will its red violence not be dissimulated by the white terror? Go back now to 241. Second paragraph. I'll let you read this on your own. There's all this talk about the white terror of truth and the red cruelty of singularities. This is not going to be a happy change. We're not all going to be in heaven having semi-orgasms or whatever, okay? Or something better than that, okay? Forever and ever and ever. Okay? This view is painful. So, yeah, there's a lot of violence in this, but it's not the kind of violence that we might want to back off from. As for Arthur Miller, the violence of Arthur Miller, it's there, but I can loosen up some and talk about it, academically without a problem. There'll always be people who say Henry Miller, no, and that's that. The end of the discussion. He's unacceptable. And I'm sure that since I mixed him with Elizabeth Gross and others, he will never be upset. I put it there because I figured, why not? Stir the pot, right? Piss them off. Have them respond so that I can then respond. Yes. Oh, you get the ball. So, who else were you talking about? Henry Miller and...
Oh, well, you mentioned Henry Miller as an analogous in some ways to Whitman. With regard.
So as early as page 12, he's talking about the red cruelty of singularities. And what's another word for them? Intensities. Intensities. Versus the white terror of truth. The white terror of truth is the descriptive. So with incompossibility and compossibility comes pain. So this is not it's not talking about a utopia. That right there, EU is happy. Atopia is like negative, right? It doesn't exist. So the EU-topia without the dash there is a happy place. Everyone has everything they want. No one, even who tries to promise that is going to be in deep trouble trying to talk about the body, just the body alone. So this is not a utopia. And he is not putting forth a new world here. Okay. he's critiquing without critique, let's say. The X without X. Anyone can say he's critiquing it. Yes, he is. Okay, where is the okay, page 10. With this pain, perhaps at the center, this new event, truly awful, full of awe. This same Egyptian face, staring into space, with its impassive gaze, it has become yesterday evening a black night. The figure of the young woman has become the death mask of the young man. The cops they kept watch over and beaten up 2 years ago in an island prison bordering the African seaboard, in whose body had been buried after his father refused, having examined it, to admit their version of death by suicide. And so, okay. And he spoke. Wait a minute. It is the same face, the same narrow forehead, big nose, a little crooked, and a third-grade identifying feature of the Abyssinian type, the same fineness of the jaw, and he spoke all the time while she kept silent. He yielded, escaping to his death and looking for it through floods of words, speaking like a Negro, multiplying the ambushes of words. But his search was so soft and imperious that it was followed by visible effects, just like physical actions. If his death could have exploded as his words exploded into palpable transformations when he was his body, to make of his death his active body again, transformer, the anagrams of his nomen were Roma, Amor.
You see the inversion.
Mm-hmm. And right behind it I had D, comma, lowercase f. And this tension, above all difficulty and intolerance, is associated with the incompossibility of all these simultaneous figures. You would need to be 100% Christian and stupid to think. Would need to be to think that these Romans and Negroes are libidinal idiots, innocents plunged into debauchery. This suffering through excess is that of the Balkans. It proceeds from the incompossibility of figures, of masks, while together occupy the same space-time and thereby reveal the libidinal band and so on. Okay, and jump down a few lines. Is this the dissolution of unity? Okay, it is unbearable. Is this because it is the dissolution of unity? This is there's a passage about, that's being referred to here in Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy, which I'll talk about in a minute. Having centuries, almost 2 millennia of disfiguring traditions, upheld by religions, metaphysics, capital, identity, it is possible that all intensity is suffering only because we are religious, or clergy of the zero. Even to say this is perhaps a consolation. Okay, our danger, we libidinal economists, lies in building a new morality. With this consolation of proclaiming and broadcasting that the libidinal band is good. Look how careful he is. Now he's arguing against himself. That the circulation of affects is joyful. That the anonymity and the incompossibility of figures are great and free. That all pain is reactionary and conceals the poison of a formation issuing from the great zero. What I have just said. But it is not an ethics, this or another, that is required. Perhaps we need an ars vita, the art of living, right? Young man. but then one in which we would be the artists and not the propagators, the adventurers and not the theoreticians, the hypothesizers and not the censors. We do not even have to say this great zero. What a crap. What crap. What is he doing now? He's totally critiquing himself. He's pulling the rug out from himself. After all, it is a figure of desire. And from what does it, one cannot assume a position on the twisted, shock-ridden, electrified, labyrinthine band. One's got to get this into one's head. The instantiation of intensities on an original nothing, on an equilibrium, and the folding back of complete parts onto the libidinal moving band in the form of a theatrical volume does not proceed from an error, from an illusion, from malice, from counter-principle, but again, from desire. As you read on, let me suggest to you, especially when you get into Nicomachean erotics in the chapter after that is, everything is a libidinal economy. There's nothing else. And so what are you supposed to do with that? As well as there is the strong suggestion that capitalism may very well be a libidinal economy itself. We don't know. We don't have an idea of what capitalism is. We don't know what we're fighting. Okay? And its abuses and its the way it handles people. Heartless. So we don't have a clue. We don't know how to fight it. So it would only reason that it might be like the libidinal. Okay? It's not a matter of accepting the notion of the libidinal economy. And therefore Marx would be okay. Okay. There would be no change. In the video you're going to see. We could show it now. Maybe we should show it now. Is that okay? Would you like to see the 20-minute video? And you'll be getting somebody else's point of view, Laura Kitness. Done in 1990, and it is, as I said, a bit campy. It's sort of why what's going on. Yes. By the way, Nicole had to leave to call her children, so if you're wondering.
His body just erupted. It became a battleground. The only cure at the time was arsenic. shortly after his mother died. It continued throughout his life.
His body just erupted.
In 1848, Tocqueville warned, "We are sleeping on a volcano. A wind of revolution blows. The storm is on the horizon." That year, Marx and Engels completed the Communist Manifesto. Jean-Martin Charcot, who had later devoted himself to the study of hysteria, enters medical school. The same year, revolution swept Europe. Students and workers united, but 3 years later, the revolution was toppled.
Looking back 15 years later to the failed revolution.
Dear Engels, one thing is sure, the era of revolution is now once more fairly opened in Europe, and the general state of things is good. But the comfortable illusions and the almost childish enthusiasms with which we greeted the era of revolution before February 1848 are gone to the devil. Old comrades are gone, others have fallen away or decayed, and a new generation is not yet in sight. In addition, we now know what role stupidity plays in revolutions and how they are exploited by scoundrels. Let us hope that this time will allow a course from east to west and not vice versa.
He writes with nostalgia and longing for something thwarted, for something that didn't happen.
France, May 68. Students and workers united in a 3-week general strike demanding radical democratic reforms. Momentarily, revolution seemed possible, but once again, that possibility was soon expelled. In the decades following 68, like the aftermath of 1848, the defeat of forces of change left traces, absences, an unfilled place where something is wanting.
Dear Frederick, 2 hours ago I received a telegram that my mother is dead. Fate claimed one of my family. I must go to Trier to settle my inheritance. I myself stood with one foot in the grave.
Writing Capital, his narrative of the conditions of the English proletariat, his body broke out with a proletarian disease. Marx was desperate to finish his work, but unable to. Instead of writing, he was being written. The revolution he anticipated, the thwarted revolution, was displaced onto his own skin.
Dear Fred, it is clear that on the whole I know more about the carbuncle disease than most doctors. Here and there I have the beginnings of new carbuncles, which keep on disappearing, but they force me to keep my working hours within limits. I consider it my vocation to remain in Europe, to complete the work in which I have been engaged for so many years, but I cannot work productively for more than a few hours daily without feeling the effect physically. I think that this work I am doing is much more important for the working class than anything I could do personally at a congress of any kind. I would consider myself impractical if I had dropped dead without having finished my book, at least in manuscript.
His body just erupted.
Dear Kugelman, cut, lance, etc., and short treated in every respect. In spite of this, the thing is continually breaking out anew. I hope it will end this week, but who can guarantee me against another eruption?
Writing Capital, imagining Capital's overthrow, his body living out his split identification.
Dear Frederick, you see I am still here, and I will tell you more. I am incapable of moving about. This is a perfidious Christian illness.
Marx took up the task of exhaustively analysing the historical moment in which he found himself, the rise of industrialization and the inception of the working class movement.
In the meantime, I can neither walk, nor stand, nor sit, and even lying down is damned hard. You see how the wisdom of nature has afflicted me.
He stripped the facade of Capital to reveal what was concealed, the labour in the commodity, the alienation of the worker, naked exploitation by the capitalist. He looked to the material foundations of the moment. He looked to the body.
Would it not have been more sensible if instead of me it had been consigned to try the patience of a good Christian?
His analysis of Capital relies on a language of the body, production, consumption, collective wealth of the state is the body, the labour of the workers. Capital amputates the worker from his own body. He has phantom pain for his missing limbs.
Like a true Lazarus, I am scourged on all sides.
But for Marx, which bodies were absent, unspoken, unacknowledged?
What's a real body? A natural body. It doesn't exist. There's only the social body. The body is theater, the body that speaks. But in whose language?
As he nears completion of the first volume, his carbuncles, mobile, sardonic and insistent, break out in ever new vicinities.
His body became sarcastic.
Feeding the flesh, sculpting it into a body bulging, protuberant, not closed and finished, not refined.
This wasn't a body you could take into the drawing room. This was an ill-mannered body.
You have too low an opinion of the English doctors if you think that they cannot diagnose carbuncles, particularly here in England, the land of carbuncles, which is actually a proletarian illness. It is only in the last few years that I've been persecuted by the thing. Before that, it was entirely unknown to me.
Marx, who would disavow the opposition between the social and the psychic as mere bourgeois psychology, was possessed of a body whose symptoms mocked the social order. It had become grotesque, open, protruding, extended, secreting, in process taking on new forms, shapes. His body, the figure of the new society that had failed to emerge. He was producing more and more body, too much body for a social order dedicated to its concealment.
Dear Engels, it was good that you did not come on Saturday. My story, now 14 days old, had reached a crisis point. I could talk a little, and it hurt even to laugh on account of the big abscess between nose and mouth, which this morning has been reduced at least to reasonable proportions. Also, the violently swollen lips are becoming reduced closer to their previous dimensions. May the head of the devil go through such 14 days. All this stops being a joke.
What a problem the body is. The creation of a meek, submissive, hygienic public body.
Capital produces a disgusting body, so it can create new regimes, new products, to police it and make it acceptable. Capital has achieved historical advances in the threshold of delicacy. It produces new varieties of bourgeois disgust, then markets a new and improved body without byproducts, without smells, to exist in a public sphere that is increasingly phobic about the collective body, the lower class body, the mob, a body that might not mind its manners.
And I figure that's the best that I have because I hate my legs.
I would just never expose my stomach ever.
Yeah.
Never. I could never wear a half shirt.
I'll take this size 14 pair of shorts and then with the size 5 belt because my hips are so large. I have a really big problem with like the roll. You wouldn't think you got fat back here, but you can't see the string on me because my fat covers up the string. But see, I think weight at stomach I'm always conscious anyway I sit. I'm like, okay, I'm sitting like this.
Always like that. Whenever I'm sitting like somewhere, and that's why I like hate summer clothes. I hate summer clothes.
Yeah.
I hate exposing my body for some reason, and I'm always conscious of like, how am I sitting? Am I sitting like this? Can you see my stomach?
How do you exercise that part of your body? What do you do to get this up? I mean, I refuse to like, I let him order first and I pretend I'm dieting. I've done every single diet. Really? I've done
You guys want that?
I love it. Weight Watchers, weight loss clinic.
But don't you feel like no way to diet to work?
I feel so comfortable eating in front of my boyfriend, in front of any guy. It just feels so much better. I mean, it's so slow. I have a friend who used to do it, and she eats salad. This is what she eats. Huge salad. She got on all the dressing and everything, and that's easy to regurgitate.
Women's bodies as tablets of social meaning, as sites of regulation.
Anorexia, bulimia, epidemic in abandoned Western society. societies post-1968. 10 to 20% of American women now have eating disorders. Let's wrest this out of secrecy, out of the private sphere, and view it for a moment as a social, collective act.
With our increasingly phobic relation to the collective body, the working class body, with our creation of an ideal public body without fat, without snot or BO, with a yearning for refinement, we will the disappearance of the body, the containment of the mass, the body politic, the threat.
Marx, writing history from below, the history of wealth as labour, the history of the body, the history of the mass, his own body acting out.
Stories told by the body. After the failed revolutions of 1848, this comes to be known as hysteria and sweeps through Europe.
Dear Frederick, I would have written you sooner, but for approximately the last 12 days, all reading, writing, and smoking have been strictly forbidden. I had a sort of eye inflammation tied up with a very unpleasant effect on the nervous system. The thing is now so far under control that I can again dare to write. In the meantime, I have all kinds of psychological reveries, like a person going blind or crazy.
Marx's symptoms make their appearance around the time that Freud's future teacher, Charcot, is beginning to recognize and treat a new disease, traumatic hysteria. Charcot began to recognize that what is novel about traumatic hysteria is that in these cases, what lay behind the symptoms were not physical disorders, not just nerves, but ideas.
Male hysteria is not all that rare. And just among us, gentlemen, these cases are often unrecognized, even by distinguished doctors. That a strong and vital worker, never prone to emotional instability before, should become hysteric, just as a woman might. This seems to us beyond imagination, and yet it is a fact.
Dear Fred, I wanted to write you yesterday from the British Museum, but I suddenly became so unwell that I had to close the very interesting book that I held in my hand. A dark veil fell over my eyes, then a frightful headache, and a pain in the chest. I strolled home. Air and light helped me, and when I got home I slept for some time. My condition is such that I really should give up all working and thinking for some time to come, but that would be difficult even if I could afford it. Dear Frederick, in recent weeks it has been positively impossible for me to write even 2 hours a day. Apart from pressure without there are the household headaches which always affect my liver. I have become sleepless again and have had the pleasure of seeing 2 carbuncles bloom near the penis. Fortunately, they faded away. My illness always comes from the head.
Charcot related male hysteria to trauma. As the industrial era progressed, the number of unexplained work-related illnesses increased enormously. Charcot worked to demonstrate how these could be understood as hysterical.
Dear Frederick, the doctor is quite right. The excessive night work was the main cause of the relapse.
It was an infection by ideas.
The most disgusting thing for me was the interruption of my work. But I have drudged on, lying down, even if only at short intervals during the day. I could not proceed with the purely theoretical part. The brain was too weak for that. Hence, I have enlarged the historical part on the workday, which lay outside the original plan.
Forgot the symptomatics of the day. You took the cure.
The medical world had devised various techniques for palliating an irritated and erupting human nervous system. Popular techniques included warm milk and bed rest, hydrotherapy and sojourns at peaceful pastoral spas. Doctors intuitively offered patients physical and psychological means to flee psychocultural stress, sending patients to the country, the sea, the mountains. Marx tried all of these. On doctor's orders, he fled his work.
Dear Frederick, so far I've had 2 sulfur baths, tomorrow the 3rd. From the bath, one steps on a raised board in the altogether. The bath attendant alternately bombards all parts of the corpus except for the head for 3 minutes, first strongly, then weakly up to the legs and feet, and always advancing crescendo. You can see how little desire a man has to write here.
Removing himself from his work brought some relief.
Dear Frederick, from the delayed appearance of this letter you can see how professionally I use my time here. I read nothing, write nothing. Because of the arsenic 3 times daily, one has time only for meals and strolling along the coast and the neighboring hills. There is no time left for other things. Evenings when it's too tired to do anything but sleep.
His symptoms began to speak him.
My dear daughter, I am afflicted with an inflammation of the eye. Not that there is much to be seen of it. The eye has taken to the vicious habit of shedding tears on its own account, without the least regard of the feelings of his master.
The carbuncles continue to erupt, stalling the writing of capital, inscribing themselves into the text. Marx focused doggedly on the labouring body, while his own body exploded into new and ever-changing configurations, as if fearful of the effect of introducing the unregimented body into the realm of the political.
But then this brings other bodies into the picture. The desiring body, the woman's body, the undisciplined body.
Marx, even in the most dire poverty, did what he could to maintain a bourgeois household. It was Helene de Much, the servant, who marked his own separation from the working class. She, more than Marx, straddles 2 worlds, belonging to both the bourgeois family and the working class. She was certainly the member of that world that Marx knew best.
Dear Laura, some recent Russian publications, printed in Holy Russia, not abroad, show the great run of my theories in that country. Nowhere is my success more delightful to me. It gives me the satisfaction that I damage a power which, besides England, is the true bulwark of the old society.
For the 19th century bourgeois male, the servant provoked social anxiety. She was 10 years younger than Marx's wife Jenny. Lenchen, as she was called, ran the Marx household. Often Marx was too poor to pay her, but she cast her lot with the Marx family. She did the cooking, house cleaning, laundering, dressmaking, nursing, and everything else, including taking the bed sheets to the pawn shop when eviction was threatened. In 1851, at age 28, she gave birth to Marx's son, secretly.
Marx wrote to Engels of a very tangled family situation, hinting at a mystery, a tragicomic mystery, in which he, Engels, also played a role. Marx travelled to Manchester to see Engels, where the 2 negotiated Lenchen's fate.
As men are accustomed to negotiating the fate of women's bodies.
Marx persuaded Engels to accept paternity for Lenchen's child, who was named Frederick after him in the custom of patrilineage. Engels accepted responsibility for the child, binding the 2 men together over Helene's mute body, over the body of the working class woman.
I never betrayed the secret. I let my baby be brought up in a working class family. Engels occasionally sent money, but Marx never acknowledged Freddie as his son. He never acknowledged paternity.
As men are accustomed to negotiating the fate of women's bodies.
After Marx's death, I moved into Engels' home as his housekeeper. My son Freddie visited regularly once a week. However, as an ordinary working man, he entered through the kitchen.
Oh, he looks like he's gaining a little weight and he's just kidding. Even though, like, he's kidding, and like he said, he's kidding.
Oh, okay.
He's
This is
kidding.
my job, and I know you're looking at me like, maybe we should start dominating. Sure, I think I need to lose a few. And you were like, lose a few?
Yeah. Walking down the street, you're like, look at her legs compared to mine.
Yeah, but think about it, that they're looking at you at the same time. But I would just like this thing. Oh, we don't, yeah. Jump from here. Oh, no. You were done. No, you're supposed to do this. You're naked and do all this. But you're getting yourself in front of here and you see how much stuff is
Oh, you must have. That feels like some torture to me.
It is, first of all, I would never ever sit like that. Ever.
I would not be able to.
Once the legs go up, the stomach goes down, and anything, I guess I would do my stomach because I'm used to it.
Really? My legs is what
I'm okay, yeah.
He simply chose not to acknowledge paternity. I didn't have that choice.
You want a continuance so you can murder your baby. Is that it? I can't define it, but I know it when I see it.
They want to ban pornography because it tells the truth.
Get your laws off my body.
How could I live in my body? Where could I live in my body?
How can I live in my body? Where can I live in my body? Dear Engels, I had decided not to write you until I could announce the completion of the book, which is now the case. Also, I did not want to bore you with the reason for the frequent delays, namely carbuncles on the posterior and in the vicinity of the penis, the remains of which are now fading and which prevent me to assume a sitting, that is, writing position, only in great pain. I do not take arsenic because it makes me too stupid, and at least for the little time that I have when writing is possible, I want to have a clear head.
Finishing the book left his body racked and scarred. He was subject to increasing outbursts with each new translation of the book. He continued to search for a cure.
My dear Jenny, I am sending you today the proofs of the French translation of Das Kapital. Today is the first day that I've been able to do anything at all. It is also the reason why I'm postponing my return, because it is absolutely necessary to return in a condition for work.
The eruptions of his body were not matched by the social eruptions he anticipated.
Dear Storage, how did it happen that in the U.S., where, relatively that is, compared to civilized Europe, land was accessible to the great masses of people, and to a certain degree, again relatively, still is, the capitalist economy and the corresponding enslavement of the working class has developed more rapidly and more shamelessly than in any country?
Marx came to regard the carbuncles as having a life of their own. His affliction had a theory and a practice.
Dear Frederick, the doctor has opened up a pleasant prospect that I will have to deal with this loathsome disease until late in January. Still, this second Frankenstein on my hump is by far not so fierce as was the first in London. You can see this from the fact that I am able to write. If one wants to vomit politics out of nausea, one must take it daily in the form of telegraphic pills, such as are delivered by the newspapers.
How could I live in my body? Where could I live in my body?
Where is the history of the body written? In your symptoms.
Once, power resided in the person of a king. The people's task was clear. Get rid of the king. Once, power resided in repressive state bureaucracies. The people's task was clear. Smash the state. At certain moments in history, power is centralized and visible. The sites of repression are clear and identifiable. Resistance movements arise out of those relations of subordination and antagonism. At other moments, the task is less clear. Power is entrenched but dispersed. Where does power reside? Who are the agents of change?
Dear Frederick, I hope that with this I will have paid my debt to nature. In my state of ill health, I can do a little writing, and then only by fits and starts. At any rate, I hope the bourgeoisie will remember my carbuncles all the rest of their lives.
Son, you ain't done nothing if you ain't been calling red. If you marked or agitated, then you bound to hear it said. You might as well ignore it or love it.
We'll talk about it when we return. Is that okay?
This sort of include actually have them?
Well, possibly, but there's no reason to believe that you didn't. It's interesting. What's this whole thing about carbuncles? The interest in it.
The skin.
I'm not. No, I'm.
The
It's
skin?
an honest question.
Just the skin?
Well, if it grows, I mean, it's this pustule, right?
Well, we didn't see anything, did we?
I didn't see it.
I mean, it's like we were not shown carbuncles. We saw them like movie clips, in certain areas.
I guess it seemed to me that they were trying to make the political situation to like exposing itself on his body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Revolting bodies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sort of the link between Marx's repression and then capitalist repression of women's bodies was a kind of unusual parallel. It's like a flip there to somehow associate him with bourgeois capitalist
Right,
economy.
and that whole like not being able to go out in public because that abscess between his nose and lips,
Yeah.
He couldn't smile.
But also that story about the daughter with the maid, it's also the contradiction which is humane, I guess.
Yeah, I think most Marxists would say, yeah, he had a bourgeois family, he was bourgeois. But it's texture, right? What would you edit in a film if you were to edit out?
Well,
What?
Oh, I was just thinking, stylistically, I think there are a lot of really, like awkward, like the superimpositions of images on top of his body and things like that. I just wouldn't do it that way, but I got the message.
I think that the this pustule as an abscess is like showing a vision of the future, of like what actually falls out of.
You mean the mirrors? You mean when they have the mirrors on his body?
No,
yeah.
They took out the bandage, it's like where the wound would have been. You just saw the video about it.
Yeah, well, even the whole like just superimposition in general, like superimposing Marx's legacy on his body. I think that notion is
Okay, it's just the precise way it looked, I guess.
Yes, the style.
It's like
the way it was done.
Yeah.
The idea is good, but it pushed me, out like.
That's all pre-digital editing. That's like
Yeah, true. Right.
What else about that video?
Reaching back to the style, like it felt like a pamphlet, like a leftist bookstore pamphlet version of video art.
Inexpensive.
Yeah, like quickly made, sort of. I really wish it just would have been longer.
It wasn't that quickly made. That was a pretty evolved.
Back in 1990, yeah, it was, or 89 this way. It was difficult.
But to really pull all those ideas off, like to take like this concept, we want to superimpose images on his body, we want to like have this like chorus of transvestites, like to actually like edit all those things together in a really like seamless kind of like high production value sort of way. Would have taken longer.
Oh, I agree.
Infinitely more complex.
Or it could have been having more scenes rather than less scenes,
Sure.
I'd be okay with that too. More violent cuts or, you know what I mean, or more harsh juxtapositions would have been fine with me too. I don't know.
Jump cut to the chorus.
Yeah.
Fewer words on the screen. I guess I'd feel like if you're showing it to me, show it to me. And I would have liked to be told a little bit less of it and have more of it enforced on me.
How did you feel about the contemporary dorm scenes? students.
Oh,
And,
yeah.
I mean, obviously I understand why they're there, but there were quite a few there. Okay.
It just seems quite frivolous to me. Although I like the connection drawn between
Yeah.
contemporary acting out of the economy through the body, and of course the gender issues.
And almost all video of male students, wasn't it?
Oh, female.
But that is
Me.
really interesting, like the images of people protesting and fighting is almost exclusively male, but then we're going to look at female bodies and talk about how females are.
The women felt like they were prompted to talk like that about their bodies, just a little bit. Like, what do you hate about your body sort of discussion. It didn't feel spontaneous to me or that truthful. Felt a little exaggerated.
Well, and it was really shallow too. It was just
Right.
like, oh, my legs.
Yeah.
And they weren't really saying anything.
They were college students, right? In a dorm. Was that what your sense? I mean, they're not suffering. As the woman who cleans the house for the family, the Marx family, and what happened to her. But nonetheless, I mean, I understand why the contemporary women were placed in there is very clear. It didn't require any thought at all. You know, properly belongs there. I'm just wondering how. I'm sorry.
Oh, the one shot that I remember really vividly is the map of the United States with, and then all of these bulimics stooped over toilets.
Yeah.
What was that supposed to mean? I mean, it was
There are bulimics all over.
It was awkward, but I think by showing it's not a personal, problem, psychological problem, looking at it from a different scale, it becomes a political problem.
It just seems a bit strange that they zeroed in on those particular issues though, because that's kind of really specific.
It seemed like all the females were white and of a certain, maybe I can assume a certain economic background.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like they have the luxury to be bulimic or the luxury to sit around and talk about their, yeah. And it was also taking place in the 80s, I think, or it seemed it was the 80s. When was it?
Maybe 80s.
89.
Yeah, it was
So that,
published, so to speak, in 1990.
What was the intention of this film when it was released?
I don't know, tell me. I mean, I think I know. It was an attempt to take Marx and to critique him. He is critiqued him. There's that line in here, he's writing the revolution, but the revolution is writing him on his body, on his body. Feminine, eclectic, I can't tell you, écriture, it's feminine writing on the body, okay, but it's placed on his body. Feminine écriture. It was a critique of him in as much as this is a critique of him as well. I'm well aware that I said that this book is not into critique, but it falls into critique. I mean, I pointed that out to you.
It seems to be some of a commentary as well. Like the people devote their entire lives to trying to understand Marx, like in the whole all his works, and almost like showing where some of this stuff comes from. It might not be this notion of logic and reason that some of these theories came out of, but out of his body and his sickness. And, I don't know. That's what I was thinking about.
But I thought it was good that they brought in, you know, this disease, both the body and the body in terms of mental situations that people find themselves in, as opposed to the work, the hard work, the lack of cleanliness, the inability to, you know, take care of their bodies as they should. It's good. The human body. If you were to shoot this film, what would you choose? What would you do? If you were to just say, I want to make a film, a video like this, video of Marx, too. Marx, the video too. What would you do? How would you do it differently? And if it's not on Marx, what on who?
I wouldn't mind shooting a biopic about Celine. Maybe in like 1960, when he was in Paris, still writing. A little paranoid. Very paranoid.
I think it'd be fun to have those two, not a video, but to have those two texts, the, you know, Das Kapital and the Carbuncle letters to Engels, and play around with those. I think that would be great.
Yeah, like parallel passages or something.
I don't know,
Some
some kind of,
version.
yeah, maybe.
Has somebody made a film about Marx's relationship with his housekeeper?
If so, I don't know.
That'd be a good film, like just straight film.
It would be difficult to shoot probably, you know, without turning it into they're making it, you know, or something like that. Having sex or whatever. But I thought it was presented in detail enough for us to get the real sense of what's going on, you know, in terms of the voiceover telling us what's going on. And so sometimes they couldn't pay her, but at least she got food and so on.
If they were to shoot that type of film, they could also make it centered around a child, Freddie, to stay away of the time frame. And bring it over to another family. That's an interesting figure.
That line was perfect when she says, even though he was who he was, he always had to go in through the kitchen door, like workers do. So, you know, it's all that.
That in itself is sort of a revolting line, you know, a shame.